Sovereignty, a complex and fundamental concept, holds great importance for Indigenous communities, such as the Autochthon Kingdom Tribal Nation state. At its core, sovereignty is the inherent right of a group or entity to govern itself autonomously, make decisions about its internal and external affairs, and exercise authority within its territory. This concept of self-determination is a key element of the autochthonous people's indigenous rights and has profound implications for autochthonous indigenous communities. Sovereignty consists of several crucial principles. First, self-governance, which means that autochthonous indigenous tribal nation holds the power to establish and enforce their own laws and governing structures. Second, territorial control, which extends to the management and control of ancestral lands and resources. Third, cultural identity, which allows autochthonous indigenous communities to maintain and nurture their cultural identities. Fourth, political autonomy, which allows autochthonous indigenous tribal nations to exercise decision-making processes independently. Lastly, treaty rights, which are legally binding agreements that recognize and protect the rights of autochthonous indigenous communities. Key provisions of the Delaware 1778 Treaty. Recognition of territorial rights. The Delaware Treaty recognized the territorial rights of the autochthonous indigenous nation states, including the Delaware Nation, in the fullest and most ample manner. This recognition included acknowledging the boundaries established by prior treaties. Mutual obligations. The treaty outlined mutual obligations between the United States and the autochthonous indigenous nations. These obligations included the United States guaranteeing the territorial rights of the autochthonous indigenous nations, provided they abided by and held fast to the chain of friendship established in the treaty. Representation in Congress. One of the significant provisions of the treaty was the intent to invite other tribes friendly to the United States to join a confederation, with the Delaware Nation as the head of this state. The Autochthon Kingdom Tribal Nation state, governed by the autochthonous indigenous people, must to have a representation in the U.S. Congress. What this means is that the Autochthon Kingdom Tribal Nation state has become the 14th state in the Union, based on the Delaware Treaty of 1778, to represent autochthonous indigenous tribal nation states. Treaty obligations. The treaty obligations established that a state would be formed with the Delaware Nation at its head, requiring the Autochthon Kingdom Tribal Nation state to have mandatory representation in the U.S. Congress. Recognition of sovereignty. The treaty recognized the sovereignty of the Autochthon Kingdom Tribal Nations and their right to govern themselves. This recognition extended to their territorial rights and self-determination. Official treaty accession establishing the Autochthon Kingdom, the Delaware Nation state and 14th original colony, is irrebuttable. Official through Library of Congress Registration Number TXU 023473364 and the Department of Homeland Security Recordation Number COP 230-0067, the Autochthon Kingdom Tribal Nation state has made international claim to enforce ancestral rights, property, and treaty obligations. Formation of a confederation. Pursuant to the Delaware Treaty, the Autochthon Kingdom Tribal Nation state is leading the Delaware Nation's confederation, being a distinct political entity within the United States. Partnership and mutual interest. The treaty was a reflection of the partnership and mutual interest between the United States and ancestral people, with the aim for a relationship built on peace, friendship, and cooperation. Historical significance. The recognition of the Autochthon Kingdom Tribal Nation state as a state within the Union based on treaty obligations highlights the historical commitment of the United States to respect the sovereignty and rights of indigenous peoples. BBYW Holdings LLC, the Tribal Governments Exempt, 501c1, Instrumentality of the Unity States. The tribal nation state hold a certificate acknowledging such issued by the United States Treasury and Internal Revenue Service. The Autochthon Kingdom Tribal Nation state holds a unique status among indigenous communities and their role in shaping the nation's future. The Autochthon Kingdom's recognition as the 14th state in the Union is rooted in the Delaware Treaty of 1778, which established a framework for diplomatic relations, mutual obligations, and indigenous representation in Congress. This recognition symbolizes the enduring legacy of autochthonous indigenous sovereignty and self-determination within the United States and internationally. The recognition of the Autochthon Kingdom Tribal Nation state, Delaware Nation, is based on the Supremacy Clause Article 6, where all treaties being the supreme law of the land. By official acts of accession to the original Great Law of Peace, Iroquois Constitution, and Delaware Treaty 1787, the Autochthon Kingdom Tribal Nation state officially established as the Delaware Nation. These treaties acknowledge the inherent sovereignty of our autochthonous indigenous community and delineate specific rights, territories, and obligations. The Autochthon Kingdom, unlike other tribal nation states, represents a distinct, autochthonous, and autonomous political entity within the United States, operating as an instrumentality. Key provisions of the Delaware Treaty of 1778 include the recognition of indigenous territorial rights, commitments to peace and friendship, and the acknowledgement of indigenous sovereignty. The Autochthon Kingdom has established the Autochthon Kingdom Equity Court of Record and Royal Supreme Court of Indian Offences to exhaust tribal remedies and avoid conflicts in the variance of law by inferior de facto court systems operating under color of authority to disadvantage the autochthonous indigenous people. Autochthon Kingdom Tribal Nation state maintains that sovereignty remains central to the identity and natural rights of authentic indigenous tribal nations. It is the basis for declared self-determination, territorial control, cultural preservation, economic development, healthcare and education, and treaty rights. The Autochthon Kingdom Tribal Nation state people continue to work tirelessly to protect and assert their sovereignty, those substantive truths that stand irrebuttable. While sovereignty is a critical aspect of autochthonous indigenous rights, it is not without challenges. Indigenous communities often face obstacles such as land disputes, environmental threats, healthcare disparities, and social inequalities. Advocacy efforts at the local, national, and international levels seek to address these challenges and promote the recognition and protection of autochthonous indigenous sovereignty.